The metal fence screamed. Not a bark, not a growl, a full-bodied collision of muscle and rage that sent dust spiraling through. Somewhere in the corrugated maze of the Limpopo sanctuary, something wanted out. Elias Vance heard it before Dr. Sarah Kumalo could warn him. "That's Brutus," Sarah said, her voice tight. "The one I told you about. The one we're putting down next week." Elias didn't flinch. "He's not aggressive," Elias said quietly, already moving toward the noise. "He's terrified." Sarah grabbed his arm. "He put 2 handlers in the hospital. He doesn't know the difference between friend and prey anymore." Elias smiled, a ghost of the soldier he used to be. "Neither do I." Before we begin, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible true stories that will leave you speechless. And truly, I am curious. Where in the world are you watching from? We love to see how far our stories travel. Drop your location in the comments below. Now, let's dive into today's story. 3 years earlier, Elias Vance could see the world in high definition. He could read the tension in a suspect's shoulders from 50 yards away, could spot an IED's telltale disturbance in the dirt from the passenger seat of a Humvee, could watch his canine partner Max's ears swivel and know exactly what the German Shepherd had detected before the dog even alerted. Vision wasn't just sight, it was the foundation of everything that made Elias good at his job, everything that kept his unit alive on the roads outside Kandahar where death hid in culverts and abandoned vehicles and piles of ordinary-looking rubble. The day it ended started like any other patrol. Dawn breaking over the Hindu Kush, Max panting in the back of the vehicle, his dark eyes bright with the focused energy that made him the best explosives detection dog in their battalion. They were returning from a village sweep, tired but clean, when Max went rigid. His nose lifted, nostrils flaring, and he released the low whine that meant danger, close, immediate. Elias called the halt, reached back to clip Max's tactical vest to his lead, and stepped out into the morning heat with his partner at his side. Max pulled left toward what looked like nothing, just another pile of rubble at the roadside, sun-bleached and unremarkable. But Elias had learned to trust the dog's nose over his own eyes, had staked his life on that trust a dozen times before. He signaled his unit to fall back, gave Max the command to search, and watched his partner move forward with careful, precise steps, each paw placement deliberate, professional, perfect. The explosion came from behind them. Not the rubble pile Max had detected, but a secondary device buried in their retreat path, sophisticated and patient, waiting for exactly this moment when the unit would cluster together thinking they'd found the primary threat. Elias remembered the flash of white light, the sensation of flying, Max's sharp bark of alarm cut off mid-sound. Then nothing. No sight, no sound, just the smell of burning and the taste of copper in his mouth and the absolute certainty that he was dying. He woke 3 days later in a hospital in Germany with bandages wrapped around his head and a chaplain sitting beside his bed. The doctors told him about his eyes, irreparable damage to both optic nerves, permanent blindness, medical discharge, therapy, adjustment, a new normal. He let the words wash over him like white noise, waiting for them to get to the only thing that mattered. Finally, he asked about Max. The chaplain's pause told him everything before the words did. Max had taken the brunt of the blast trying to shield Elias, had died before the medevac helicopter touched down. They'd given the dog a hero's burial with full military honors. They'd given Elias a Purple Heart and a lifetime of darkness and the knowledge that his partner had sacrificed everything while Elias couldn't even see it happen. For 2 years, Elias existed in that darkness, learning to navigate a world that had become foreign and hostile. Physical therapy taught him to walk without sight. Occupational therapy taught him to dress himself, cook for himself, pretend to be independent. But no one could teach him how to stop hearing Max's whine in his dreams, how to forget the weight of a tactical vest in his hands, how to fill the void where purpose used to live. He'd been a soldier, a handler, a leader. Now he was just a blind man who couldn't save his own dog. Then he heard about Brutus, a retired police Rottweiler scheduled for euthanasia after turning on his handler, labeled dangerous and irredeemable, abandoned by the system that had trained him for war and discarded him when war left its marks. Something about the story resonated in the hollow place where Elias's heart used to be. Maybe it was time to prove that warriors, human or canine, didn't become expendable just because they carried invisible wounds. Elias had traveled 8,000 miles not to save Brutus, but to offer him something no one had offered either of them since the explosions that changed everything. The chance to be warriors again. Together. Dr. Sarah Kumalo had seen dangerous animals before. She'd worked with leopards that could open a man's throat in half a second, with Cape buffalo that charged at vehicles for sport, with a black mamba that had somehow found its way into the sanctuary's medical supply room. But none of those creatures unsettled her the way Brutus did. Predators, she understood. Predators had rules, patterns, predictable responses to stimuli. Brutus had none of that. He was chaos in a Rottweiler's body, and Sarah had learned to trust her instincts about chaos. They called him the Widowmaker, she said, leading Elias along the dusty path toward the isolation kennels. Her voice carried the weight of someone who'd seen too many good intentions end badly. Not officially, of course. But that's what the handlers whispered when they thought no one was listening. 3 years with the Johannesburg Metro Police K9 unit. 47 successful operations. Drug busts, weapon seizures, suspect apprehensions. He was perfect. Absolutely perfect. Until he wasn't. Elias's cane tapped rhythmically against the ground. His face turned slightly toward her voice. What changed? Sarah stopped walking, and Elias stopped with her, somehow sensing the shift in her posture even though he couldn't see it. A raid went wrong. Human trafficking operation in Hillbrow, one of the most dangerous neighborhoods in the city. Brutus and his handler, Officer Petrus van der Merwe, went in first as they always did. The intelligence was bad. Instead of finding victims, they walked into an ambush. 4 gunmen, automatic weapons, a kill box designed specifically for the tactical team. She could still see the incident report, could still remember the photographs that had accompanied it. Petrus took 2 rounds to the chest. His vest saved his life, but he went down hard. The team returned fire, neutralized the threats, but in the chaos, something happened to Brutus. When they tried to evacuate Petrus, the dog wouldn't let anyone near him. Not the paramedics, not his fellow officers, not even his backup handler who'd worked with Brutus for months. He stood over Petrus's body and attacked anything that moved. They had to tranquilize him just to get medical attention to his handler. Elias's expression didn't change, but Sarah saw his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. That doesn't sound unprovoked. That sounds like a dog protecting his partner. That's what everyone thought at first, Sarah continued, resuming their walk. But it didn't stop. After the raid, Brutus became increasingly aggressive. He bit his veterinarian during a routine examination. He lunged at a fellow K9 handler during training. He attacked a maintenance worker who approached his kennel to clean it. Each incident more violent than the last, each time without warning or apparent cause. The department brought in 3 different behavioral specialists. All of them reached the same conclusion. The dog had developed severe PTSD, had lost the ability to distinguish between threats and routine interactions, had become fundamentally unstable. They reached the isolation kennel area, and Sarah felt the familiar tightness in her chest that always came when she approached Brutus's enclosure. Officer van der Merwe refused to give up on him. He visited every week for 6 months, trying to rebuild their bond. On his last visit, Brutus broke through a supposedly secure barrier and went straight for his throat. If there hadn't been 3 handlers with breaksticks present, Petrus would be dead. That's when they issued the kill order. That's when they sent him here to me because no one else would take him. She turned to face Elias, even though she knew he couldn't see the concern etched across her features. I've been doing this work for 15 years, Elias. I've rehabilitated animals that everyone else wrote off as hopeless. But Brutus is different. Every attempt to interact with him results in violence. Every moment he's awake, he's either throwing himself against the fence or standing in the corner of his kennel staring at nothing, like he's seeing ghosts. The police psychologist who evaluated him said he's experiencing a complete dissociative break from reality. He doesn't see handlers or helpers anymore. He only sees threats. From the kennel ahead came the sound of claws scraping against concrete, followed by a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. Sarah felt her pulse quicken despite herself. That's him. That's the sound he makes 18 hours a day. The other 2 hours, he paces. He hasn't slept properly in 6 months. He hasn't eaten a full meal in weeks. His body is consuming itself from the inside out because his mind won't let him rest. She placed a hand on Elias's arm, her grip gentle but firm. I need you to understand what you're asking to face. This isn't a dog anymore, Elias. This is a weapon with a broken safety, and I cannot guarantee your survival if something goes wrong. Elias stood silent for a long moment, his face turned toward the kennel where Brutus waited in his concrete cell. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a conviction that made Sarah's breath catch. Then maybe it's time someone stopped treating him like a weapon and started treating him like a soldier. Elias approached the chain-link fence with the careful deliberation of a man who understood that every movement told a story. Behind him, he could hear Sarah's sharp intake of breath, could sense the 2 handlers who'd accompanied them taking instinctive steps backward. Their fear rolled off them in waves, shallow breathing, the rustle of fabric as hands moved toward tranquilizer guns, the subtle shift of weight onto the balls of their feet ready to run. It was a language Elias had learned to read in the darkness, the vocabulary of bodies preparing for violence. Inside the kennel, Brutus had gone absolutely still. No growling now. No throwing his massive body against the fence. Just silence, but not the peaceful kind. This was the silence of a predator calculating distance and angles, the silence before an explosion. Elias could hear the dog's breathing, could hear the soft click of claws against concrete as Brutus shifted his weight, could smell the sharp musk of an animal who'd lived too long in fight-or-flight mode. He's watching you, Sarah whispered from somewhere behind Elias's left shoulder. I've never seen him this focused on anyone. Usually by now he'd be, she cut herself off, but Elias could fill in the blanks. Usually by now he'd be attacking, trying to tear through the fence, proving why they called him the Widowmaker. Elias reached out slowly until his fingers found the sun-warmed metal of the chain link. The fence hummed with tension, and on the other side, Brutus released a sound that wasn't quite a growl, more like a question asked in a language only soldiers understood. He's not watching me, Elias said quietly. He's watching you. All of you. What? Sarah's confusion was evident in her voice. Listen to him, Elias instructed, tilting his head slightly. Really listen. That's not aggression. That's a threat assessment. He's not deciding whether to attack me. He's deciding whether he needs to protect me from you. One of the handlers, a young man whose cologne was too strong and whose breathing had gone rapid and shallow, let out a nervous laugh. Protect you? Sir, with all due respect, that dog has put 3 people in the hospital. He doesn't protect anyone. He attacks. Elias turned his face toward the voice, and something in his expression made the young handler's laugh die in his throat. You're afraid of him. You think he's broken, unstable, unpredictable. And every time you approach this kennel, you bring that fear with you. You broadcast it in every breath, every movement. He turned back to the fence. Brutus can smell it. Can smell the adrenaline, the cortisol, the chemical signature of people who've already decided he's a monster. And when you treat something like a monster, it has no choice but to act like one. Sarah moved closer, her voice thoughtful now rather than defensive. Are you saying his aggression is defensive? I'm saying his aggression is a response, Elias corrected. He reached up slowly and curled his fingers through the chain link, letting his hand rest there, exposed and vulnerable. Behind him, he heard Sarah's sharp warning, heard the handlers moving forward with tranquilizer guns raised. But Elias didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't project fear or threat or anything but calm, steady presence. Inside the kennel, Brutus took a step forward. Then another. The massive Rottweiler moved with deliberate precision, his amber eyes fixed on the blind man's hand protruding through the fence. Sarah held her breath. The handlers aimed their weapons. And Elias simply waited, his breathing slow and even, his heart rate steady despite knowing that 130 pounds of supposedly rabid dog was now close enough to take his fingers off with a single snap of powerful jaws. Brutus stopped 6 inches from Elias's hand. The dog's breath was hot and moist against Elias's skin. And then, so gently that Sarah barely saw it happen, Brutus pressed his massive head against Elias's palm and exhaled, a long, shuddering breath that sounded less like a threat and more like relief. He's not broken, Elias said softly, his hand now resting on the broad plane of Brutus's skull, feeling the warmth of living muscle and bone, the rapid pulse of a heart that had forgotten how to rest. He's just tired of being afraid, tired of fighting, tired of being treated like a weapon instead of what he really is. Elias's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but in the sudden quiet of that moment, everyone heard him clearly. He's a warrior who never got permission to come home from war. In the kennel, Brutus closed his eyes for the first time in 6 months and leaned into the touch of a man who finally understood. The roar came from the north end of the sanctuary, rolling across the compound like distant thunder. It wasn't the sound of aggression or territoriality that Elias had heard from zoo lions back in the States. This was something deeper, more primal, the voice of an apex predator announcing its presence to a world that had forgotten what true danger sounded like. Even through the afternoon heat and the dusty air, Elias felt the sound resonate in his chest, felt the way it made every other creature in the sanctuary go silent in instinctive deference. Sarah's hand tightened on his arm. "That's Tao," she said, and Elias heard something in her voice he hadn't heard when she'd been warning him about Brutus. Not fear exactly, but profound respect mixed with something that might have been awe. White lion. Juvenile male, about 18 months old. Already 400 pounds and still growing. Elias turned his face toward the sound, toward the distant enclosure he couldn't see but could somehow feel, like a gravitational pull from something massive and ancient. "White lion," he repeated. "I thought those were extinct in the wild." They are. Tao came from a private breeding facility that went bankrupt. The owner was going to sell him to a canned hunting operation. You know, where rich tourists pay to shoot captive animals and call it sport. Sarah's voice carried barely contained disgust. "We intervened, brought him here. But he's not like the other rescues. He's never known hunger, never had to hunt, never learned the social structures that would make him fit into a pride. He's 400 pounds of pure predator with no understanding of boundaries or limitations." Another roar, closer this time, and Elias heard something shift in the quality of the sound that made his combat instincts flare. "His enclosure," Elias said carefully. "How secure is it?" Sarah's pause told him everything he needed to know. It was designed for adult lions, yes. Double chain link, reinforced posts, electric wire at the top. But Tao is testing it. Every day he tests it. He's learned that if he throws his weight against the gate at certain angles, the latch shifts. We've reinforced it 3 times, but he's intelligent. Frighteningly intelligent. He's figured out that the delivery trucks create distractions, that during feeding times everyone's attention is elsewhere. From Brutus's kennel behind them came a low warning growl, and Elias realized the Rottweiler had gone tense, his body rigid with attention focused in the same direction as the lion's roar. Brutus hears him, Elias observed. Brutus hates him, Sarah corrected. Or fears him. Maybe both. Every time Tao vocalizes, Brutus goes into protection mode. It's the only time his aggression seems genuinely protective rather than reactive. It's like he knows something we don't. Elias stood perfectly still, his head tilted, listening to the complex symphony of sounds that painted a picture his eyes couldn't see. The lions breathing in the distance, heavy and rhythmic. The creak of metal as something massive moved against chain link. The shuffle of Brutus's paws on concrete as the dog positioned himself between the fence and where Elias stood. And underneath it all, a tension in the air itself, like the moment before a storm breaks. How often does he escape? Elias asked quietly. He hasn't. Not yet. Sarah's voice had gone tight. But it's not a matter of if, Elias. It's a matter of when. We're waiting for funding to build a proper enclosure, something that can actually contain an animal that size and intelligence. But until then. She trailed off, and Elias heard the weight of responsibility crushing down on her shoulders. Until then, I walk past his enclosure every day and pray that today isn't the day he figures out the final piece of the puzzle. A third roar, and this time Elias caught something new in the sound. Not just power and presence, but curiosity. Tao had noticed the unusual activity at the far end of the sanctuary, had marked the presence of new scents, new possibilities. In the darkness behind Elias's sightless eyes, he could almost see the massive white predator, pale as a ghost, amber eyes fixed on the isolation kennels where a blind man stood beside a dog everyone had written off as hopeless. Sarah, Elias said slowly, when you said Brutus's aggression seems protective around the lion, has anyone considered that maybe he's not broken at all? Maybe he's just been waiting for a threat that actually deserves his vigilance. Before Sarah could answer, a delivery truck rumbled through the sanctuary gates, its engine drowning out the sounds of the African bush, and in the north enclosure, a 400-pound white lion lifted his massive head and began, very methodically, to test the weakened latch one more time. Sarah's objection came swift and certain. Absolutely not. Elias, touching him through the fence is one thing, but entering his enclosure is suicide. I can't allow it. I won't allow it. Elias stood with his hand still resting against the chain link, feeling Brutus's warmth on the other side, feeling the steady rhythm of the dog's breathing that had finally, after 6 months of chaos, found something resembling peace. He's been in that cage for half a year, Elias said quietly. Isolated. Condemned. Waiting to die. He doesn't need another person standing on the safe side of a fence telling him he's dangerous. He needs someone willing to meet him where he is. Where he is psychotic, one of the handlers interjected, his voice sharp with the kind of certainty that came from inexperience. Dr. Kumalo, this is insane. The dog has a kill order. We have protocols. Your protocols are why he's in there, Elias interrupted, his voice carrying an edge of command that made the young handler fall silent. Your protocols labeled him unstable because he wouldn't let strangers near his wounded handler. Your protocols decided he was irredeemable because he defended himself against people who approached him with fear and tranquilizer guns. Your protocols are why a decorated police dog is waiting to be euthanized instead of being treated for trauma that any combat veteran would recognize. He turned his face toward where he estimated Sarah stood. I'm not asking your permission. I'm telling you what needs to happen. Either you open that gate, or I find another way in. But I'm going in. Sarah was silent for a long moment, and Elias could hear the war happening inside her. the scientist who understood protocol warring with the woman who dedicated her life to saving animals everyone else had given up on. Finally, she exhaled slowly. If you go in there and he attacks, we can't save you fast enough. A tranquilizer takes 30 seconds to work. He can kill you in 5. He won't. Elias's certainty wasn't bravado. It was something deeper, something forged in the same darkness that had taken his sight and his partner and everything that had made him feel whole. I know what it's like to be treated like you're broken beyond repair. I know what it's like when everyone around you radiates fear and pity and the absolute conviction that you'll never be who you were before. Brutus doesn't need someone who's afraid of him. He needs someone who understands him. The sound of keys jangling, then the metallic scrape of a lock turning. Sarah's voice, steady despite the tremor Elias could hear underneath. The moment he shows aggression, we tranquilize. No hesitation. Do you understand? I understand. Elias pulled his hand back from the fence and reached down to where his white cane rested against his leg. His fingers wrapped around the familiar aluminum shaft, felt the worn grip that had guided him through 3 years of darkness. Then, deliberately, he set it down on the ground outside the enclosure. I won't need this. Sarah's sharp intake of breath told him she understood what he was doing. The cane was safety, navigation, the tool that let him move through the world without vision. Discarding it meant entering Brutus's space completely vulnerable, completely dependent on senses that most sighted people never learn to trust. It meant meeting the dog not as a blind man trying to prove something, but as a warrior acknowledging another warrior on equal terms. The gate swung open with a rusty groan. Elias stepped forward into the enclosure, his hands empty, his world reduced to sound and scent and the subtle shifts in air pressure that told him where objects existed in space. He heard Sarah close the gate behind him, heard the handler's weapons being readied, heard his own heartbeat steady and strong despite knowing that he just crossed a threshold from which there might be no return. Brutus was 10 feet away. Elias could hear the dog's breathing, could smell the musk of unwashed fur and concrete and something underneath that reminded him of Max, that particular scent of a working dog who'd been asked to be more than just an animal, who'd been trained to think and decide and carry the weight of responsibility that came with protecting human lives. "Hey, soldier," Elias said softly, and took his first step forward into the darkness where Brutus waited. "Let's find our way home." Behind him, Sarah held her breath and prayed to God she wasn't sure she believed in that the blind veteran's faith wouldn't be the last mistake either of them ever made. The first 5 minutes inside Brutus's enclosure passed in a silence so profound that Elias could hear the pulse of blood in his own ears. He'd taken 3 steps forward, then stopped, giving the dog space to decide, to assess, to make the choice that no one had given him in 6 months. Brutus circled him once, twice, his claws clicking against concrete in a rhythm that spoke of evaluation rather than aggression. Then the massive Rottweiler moved closer, and Elias felt the dog's breath against his hand, warm and steady, followed by the gentle pressure of a broad skull pressing into his palm. Outside the fence, he heard Sarah exhale, heard the handlers lowering their weapons incrementally, heard hope beginning to displace fear in the quality of their breathing. For a moment, the sanctuary existed in perfect balance, a blind veteran and a traumatized dog finding understanding in shared darkness, proving that broken didn't mean irredeemable, that warriors could come home from war if someone was willing to meet them where they stood. Then the delivery truck arrived. Elias heard it first, the rumble of a heavy diesel engine, the hiss of air brakes, the metallic clang of a cargo door rolling open. He didn't understand the significance immediately, didn't recognize why every muscle in Brutus's body had suddenly gone rigid beneath his hand. But then the wind shifted, carrying with it a sense so powerful and primal that even Elias's human nose caught it. Blood. Raw meat. The copper-sweet smell of fresh carnage that triggered something ancient in every predator within a mile radius. From the north enclosure, Tau's roar split the afternoon air. Not the lazy vocalization of a captive animal, but something sharp and focused, the sound of a hunter catching the scent of prey. Elias felt the vibration of it travel through the ground beneath his feet, felt Brutus's body shift from relaxed companionship into something else entirely. The feeding delivery. Sarah's voice carried panic now. Oh God, I forgot. Elias, get out of there right now. But Elias couldn't move because Brutus had placed himself directly between Elias and the gate, not with aggression but with deliberate protective positioning. The dog's growl started low in his chest, building in intensity, and Elias realized with sudden clarity that Brutus wasn't reacting to the scent of blood. He was reacting to something else, something his superior canine senses had detected that the humans had missed. The sound of metal giving way came like a gunshot. Sharp, final, irreversible. The gate. One of the handlers screamed. The north gate, Tao's out. Everything happened in the space between heartbeats. Elias heard running footsteps scattering in multiple directions, heard Sarah shouting commands that dissolved into static against the backdrop of his own rushing blood. He heard the handlers abandoning their posts, heard the sanctuary erupting into chaos as staff scrambled to secure the other animals, to protect themselves, to deal with the nightmare scenario they'd all known was coming but had prayed would never arrive. And beneath it all, he heard something that made his combat-trained instincts scream in recognition. The soft pad of enormous paws on dusty earth. Moving fast. Moving with purpose. Moving directly toward the isolation kennels where a blind man stood trapped inside a chain-link enclosure with nowhere to run and no way to see the 400-pound apex predator closing the distance. Brutus's growl transformed into something Elias had never heard from any dog, a sound that was part challenge, part fury, part absolute conviction. The Rottweiler moved forward, placing his body between Elias and the approaching threat, his hackles raised to make himself appear larger, his stance wide and immovable. Brutus, no, Sarah's voice broke. Elias, get down. Get down now. But Elias didn't get down. Instead, he reached out and placed his hand on Brutus's shoulder, feeling the coiled power trembling beneath thick fur, feeling the warrior's instinct to face impossible odds because someone needed protection. He'd felt this before, in the seconds before Max had thrown himself onto an IED to save Elias's life. He recognized this moment, the moment when a good dog made the choice to become a shield, no matter the cost. Easy, soldier, Elias murmured, his voice steady despite the fear flooding his system. We do this together. The white lion's breathing was audible now, heavy and rhythmic, the sound of a predator that had finally escaped captivity and found something interesting. Through the fence of the enclosure, a barrier that would stop a dog but would barely slow a 400-pound cat, Elias heard the soft whisper of a massive body moving through tall grass, heard the grass itself bending and breaking under weight that could crush bones with casual ease. Tao had come to investigate. And standing between the blind veteran and the apex predator, Brutus stopped growling and went perfectly, terrifyingly still. The silence before thunder, the breath before violence, the final moment when a warrior decides that some things are worth dying for. Elias felt the temperature drop before he understood why. The sun hadn't moved, the African heat remained oppressive, but suddenly the air around him carried a chill that had nothing to do with weather and everything to do with proximity to something that existed at the top of the food chain. He could hear Tao's breathing now, close enough that each exhale moved the air against Elias's face, close enough that the scent of the lion, musk and wildness and raw, undomesticated power, filled his lungs with every breath. The white lion was less than 6 feet away. Maybe less than 5. Elias's tactical training screamed calculations his conscious mind couldn't process. Attack range, closing speed, the impossibility of survival when an apex predator decided you were prey. His hand remained steady on Brutus's shoulder, feeling the Rottweiler's muscles coiled tight as steel cables, feeling the barely contained violence trembling beneath his palm. Sarah's voice came from somewhere beyond the enclosure. distant and desperate. "Don't move. Nobody move. Tao, easy boy, easy." But her words dissolved into nothing because the lion had already made his decision, had already committed to investigating the interesting new scents that had appeared in his territory. Elias heard the soft whisper of grass as Tao's massive paw moved forward. Heard the intake of breath that preceded action. Heard the subtle shift in weight distribution that meant the 400-pound cat was gathering himself to spring. And in that crystalline moment when time stretched thin as wire, Elias understood with absolute certainty that the next 3 seconds would determine whether he died in an African sanctuary or lived to see, metaphorically speaking, another day. Brutus moved first. The Rottweiler launched himself forward with explosive speed, but not toward Tao's throat or legs or any of the vulnerable points a dog might target in a fight. Instead, Brutus went up and over Elias in a perfect arc, his 130-pound body clearing the blind veteran's head by inches, his trajectory calculated with the precision of a tactical specialist who'd spent 3 years learning to read situations in split seconds and respond with controlled violence. The impact when Brutus hit Tao sounded like a car crash. Elias felt the vibration through the ground, felt the displacement of air as 2 massive bodies collided above him. Heard Tao's surprised snarl cut off mid-sound as Brutus's weight drove the lion sideways and down. But this wasn't an attack. This was something else entirely. Brutus pinned Tao to the ground with his full body weight centered on the lion's shoulders, his jaws clamped not around Tao's throat but around the thick mane at the base of the cat's skull. The dominance hold that wolf pack leaders use to discipline subordinates, the restraint technique that said, "I could kill you, but I'm choosing not to," in a language older than human speech. Tao thrashed once, his 400 pounds of muscle and fury attempting to throw off the dog, but Brutus held firm with a strength that seemed impossible for his size. The lion's claws raked empty air, his powerful hind legs kicked at nothing, and slowly, incrementally, the thrashing subsided. Not surrender exactly. More like recognition. The understanding that passed between predators when one established dominance not through killing but through superior positioning and unshakable will. Elias remained perfectly still, his sightless eyes open but seeing nothing, his other senses painting a picture of the impossible scene unfolding around him. Behind him, beyond the fence, he heard Sarah's stunned silence, heard the handler's weapons hanging useless because no one could shoot without risking hitting the wrong animal, heard the entire sanctuary holding its collective breath as the dangerous Rottweiler did what no one had believed possible. Brutus held Tao pinned for 15 seconds that felt like hours. The lion's breathing gradually slowed, his struggle ceased, and something profound passed between predator and guardian. An acknowledgement of boundaries, of hierarchy, of the difference between violence and protection. When Brutus finally released his grip and stepped back, he didn't retreat. He simply repositioned himself between Tao and Elias, his stance wide and immovable, his message crystal clear. "This human is under my protection, and that protection is non-negotiable." Tao rose slowly to his feet, shaking his massive white mane, his amber eyes fixed on the dog who just dominated him with nothing but courage and tactical brilliance. For a moment, the lion seemed to consider continuing the challenge. Then, with the dignified grace of a king acknowledging a worthy opponent, Tao turned and padded away through the grass, his white coat catching the afternoon sun like a ghost dissolving into legend. Elias exhaled for what felt like the first time in minutes. His hand found Brutus's shoulder again, felt the Rottweiler's sides heaving with exertion, felt the rapid hammer of a warrior's heart gradually slowing as the immediate threat passed. "Good boy," Elias whispered, his voice rough with emotion he couldn't name. "Such a good boy." Outside the enclosure, Sarah's voice came thick with tears and wonder and something that might have been vindication. "My God. He saved you. He actually saved you." But Elias knew it was more than that. Brutus hadn't just saved him. He'd proven that what everyone called violence was really protection, that what looked like aggression was really a warrior's instinct to defend, and that being dangerous and being broken were not the same thing at all. Sarah had witnessed countless moments of animal behavior in her 15 years managing the sanctuary, but nothing had prepared her for what she was watching through the chain-link fence. Brutus stood over Elias like a sentinel carved from stone, his sides heaving, his muzzle flecked with blood. His own or Tao's, Sarah couldn't tell from this distance. The white lion sat 30 feet away in the tall grass, his massive head tilted in what looked like confusion or respect or something that existed in the space between the two. And between them stood the blind veteran, his hand reaching out with impossible calm to rest on Brutus's trembling shoulder. "Elias," Sarah called softly, afraid that any sudden movement or loud sound would shatter whatever fragile equilibrium existed in that moment. "I'm opening the gate. Move slowly toward my voice." But Elias didn't move toward the gate. Instead, he turned his face toward where Tao sat watching, his sightless eyes somehow seeming to meet the lion's amber gaze despite the impossibility of it. "He's not going to attack again," Elias said, his voice carrying absolute certainty. "He's waiting." Waiting for what? Sarah's hand hovered over the gate latch, her entire body tensed to rush in with the tranquilizer gun if Tao made any aggressive movement. For permission to leave with dignity. Elias's hand moved in slow, deliberate strokes along Brutus's shoulder, and Sarah watched in amazement as the Rottweiler's rigid posture began to soften incrementally. Brutus established dominance. Now Tao needs to understand that dominance doesn't mean humiliation. That he can walk away without losing face. Sarah wanted to argue, wanted to insist that lions didn't think in terms of permission or dignity, that this was anthropomorphizing behavior that could get them all killed. But as she watched, Elias took a step forward, not toward the gate, but toward where Tao sat. Brutus moved with him, still maintaining his protective position, but the quality of the dog's vigilance had shifted from aggressive defense to watchful guardianship. "Easy, brother," Elias murmured, and Sarah realized he was speaking to Tao now, his voice pitched low and soothing. "Nobody's trying to put you back in a cage. Nobody's saying you're less than what you are. You're a king, and kings don't need to prove themselves through violence." He stopped 10 feet from the lion, close enough that Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs, far enough that Tao would have to make a conscious decision to close the distance. For a long moment, nothing moved. The African sun beat down on the frozen tableau, turning dust motes into golden sparks in the air between man, dog, and lion. Then Elias did something that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. He slowly lowered himself to one knee, bringing his head below the level of both Tao's and Brutus's, making himself vulnerable in a way that every survival instinct screamed was suicide. Brutus whined softly, uncertain, his protective instincts warring with trust in this human who spoke a language the dog recognized even if he didn't fully understand it. Elias's hand remained on the Rottweiler's shoulder, steady and reassuring, while his other hand extended toward Tao, not reaching, not demanding, simply offering. "You've been alone in that cage, haven't you?" Elias said softly. "Everyone's afraid of what you might do, so they keep their distance. They feed you, they maintain your enclosure, but nobody actually sees you. Nobody recognizes that underneath all that power and danger, you're just as isolated as Brutus was. Just as lost as I've been since the world went dark." Tao rose to his feet, and every muscle in Sarah's body tensed for action. The handlers behind her raised their weapons. But the white lion didn't charge or stalk or display any of the hunting behaviors they'd been trained to recognize. Instead, he moved forward with deliberate slowness, his massive paws placing themselves with careful precision, until he stood directly in front of Elias's outstretched hand. The lion's breath was hot and moist against Elias's palm. One swipe of those paws could disembowel a man. One bite could crush a human skull. But Tao simply stood there, this 400-pound apex predator, and allowed a blind man to rest a hand against the broad plane of his muzzle while a dangerous Rottweiler watched without aggression, without fear, without anything but the quiet understanding that sometimes the most powerful act isn't dominance or submission, it's recognition. "There you go," Elias whispered, his hand moving in slow strokes along Tao's jaw. "See? We're all just warriors trying to find our way home." Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as she watched three creatures that everyone had labeled as dangerous or broken or beyond redemption create a moment of peace that existed outside of human language, outside of training protocols, outside of everything except the silent understanding that passed between souls who'd been marked by trauma and had somehow found each other in the aftermath. When Tao finally turned and walked away, padding back toward his compromised enclosure with the dignity of a king returning to his kingdom by choice rather than force, Sarah knew she'd just witnessed something that would change how she understood every animal she'd ever work with. Elias rose slowly to his feet, his hand still resting on Brutus's shoulder, and together they turned toward the gate where Sarah stood with her heart full and her certainty shattered and her understanding of what was possible forever transformed. The morning air carried the scent of acacia blossoms and distant rain as Elias made his daily circuit of the sanctuary perimeter. His white cane remained in his quarters, unused for the past 4 months. He didn't need it anymore. Not when Brutus walked beside him, the Rottweiler's steady presence more reliable than any tool could ever be. The dog moved with easy confidence now, his limp barely noticeable, his coat glossy with health, his eyes alert but no longer haunted by shadows only he could see. They paused at the north enclosure where Tao lounged in the early sunlight, his white coat brilliant against the golden grass. The new enclosure had been completed 6 weeks ago, reinforced steel, proper height, a design that could actually contain 400 pounds of apex predator while still giving him room to move, to hunt the enrichment prey the staff provided, to be what he was meant to be without the constant stress of containment that felt like punishment. When Tao saw them approach, he rose and padded over to the fence, pressing his massive head against the chain link in greeting. Brutus sat beside Elias, his tail wagging once, twice, the gesture of one warrior acknowledging another. "Morning, brother," Elias said, reaching through the fence to scratch behind Tao's ears. The lion rumbled with contentment, a sound that would have terrified most people but that Elias had learned to recognize as the feline equivalent of peace. Behind them, Sarah emerged from the veterinary clinic, clipboard in hand, her expression softening when she saw the three of them together. "The new intake arrives this afternoon," she called out. "Belgian Malinois. Military contract dog from the Congo. PTSD, extreme aggression. Scheduled for euthanasia next week if we can't take him." She walked closer, her footsteps familiar enough now that Brutus didn't even turn his head. "I told them we'd evaluate him. Thought maybe you two could work your magic." Elias smiled, his hand finding the familiar warmth of Brutus's head. "What do you think, soldier? Room for one more." Brutus's tail thumped against the ground, and somewhere in that simple gesture lived everything they'd learned over the past 4 months. That trauma didn't have to be permanent. That warriors could learn to trust again. That being dangerous and being damaged weren't the same thing, and that sometimes the creatures everyone else feared just needed someone who understood their language. The language of service and sacrifice and the profound weight of being asked to be more than just an animal or just a man. They continued their patrol, moving past the enclosures where other rescues were learning that this sanctuary was different from the places that had given up on them. A scarred leopard that had been kept in a cage too small for a house cat. A hyena with 3 legs and the personality of a comedian. 2 elderly elephants that had survived circus abuse. Each one broken in different ways. Each one finding their way back to something resembling wholeness under Sarah's care and, increasingly, under the watchful presence of a blind veteran and his Rottweiler who'd both learned what it meant to come home from war. The sun climbed higher, burning off the morning cool, and Elias felt sweat begin to form at the base of his neck. 3 years ago he'd been sitting in a VA hospital room in Virginia, convinced that his life was effectively over, that blindness had stolen not just his sight but his purpose, his identity, his reason for existing. He'd been drowning in darkness, literally and metaphorically, unable to see a future that held anything except emptiness and loss. Then he'd heard about a dog that everyone said was beyond saving. A warrior that everyone said had crossed the line from protective to psychotic, from trained to traumatized beyond repair. And something in that story had called to him across 8,000 miles of ocean and continent, had whispered that maybe broken didn't mean finished, that maybe warriors, human and canine, just needed to find each other, needed to recognize in one another the marks that war left on souls that had been asked to be shields. Brutus leaned against Elias's leg as they reached the eastern boundary, where the sanctuary land gave way to open bush. In the distance, Elias could hear the sounds of Africa waking up, birds and insects and the rustle of things moving through grass. He couldn't see any of it, would never see any of it, but he could feel the life pulsing all around him, could sense the purpose that flowed through everything he did now. They stood there together, man and dog, two veterans who'd found their way home not by going back to who they'd been before, but by accepting who they'd become and finding meaning in helping others do the same. The guardian of Limpopo, the staff had started calling them. The blind veteran and the dangerous dog who'd proven that the most broken things sometimes become the strongest, that warriors recognize each other even in darkness, and that coming home from war isn't about forgetting what you've seen, it's about finding a new mission worth fighting for. Behind them, in the north enclosure, Tao roared his morning greeting to the sun. And Elias smiled, his hand resting on Brutus's shoulder. Finally at peace.